The purpose of this video is to introduce you to manual muscle testing. In particular, we will discuss its purpose, outline the indications for manual muscle testing, discuss the main principles behind manual muscle testing, and we'll discuss the protocol and grading system for manual muscle testing. Manual muscle testing is a tool that can be used to measure the strength of an individual muscle, such as the upper trapezius, or a functional muscle group like the knee extensors. For some muscles, it's possible to isolate them from their agonists, whereas for other muscles it's not. That's why you'll hear me referring to muscles or muscle groups throughout the video. Manual muscle testing is most sensitive for identifying strength deficits in weak muscles or muscle groups. It is not sensitive enough to identify weakness in stronger muscles or muscle groups. For example, individual A has just undergone right knee surgery, and as you can see, the right quadriceps muscle has lost muscle mass. It's atrophied, and it's likely become very weak relative to the left quadriceps muscles. In this case, manual muscle testing would be an effective tool to identify and quantify the weakness in this individual's right quadriceps muscle. Individual B does not have any significant difference in size of his quadriceps muscles. They both appear strong. Even if the right quadriceps muscle is weaker than his left, manual muscle testing would not be sensitive enough to pick up this difference. It cannot detect differences in relatively strong muscles. In fact, other strength measurement techniques exist to identify strength deficits or weakness in strong muscles or muscle groups. Let's now discuss the general principles behind manual muscle testing. First, the strength of the muscle or muscle group is tested during the concentric phase of the muscle contraction. The eccentric phase of the muscle contraction is not considered in the strength testing. The second principle relates to the effect of gravity. The ability of the muscle to move a limb in the presence or absence of the effect of gravity must be determined. Take a moment to analyze these two diagrams. In which diagram are the hip flexor muscles working in a gravity-eliminated plane? And in which diagram are the hip flexors working in the against gravity plane? Diagram A represents the gravity minimized plane, as the effect of gravity wants to adduct the hip and not extend it. Diagram B represents the against gravity plane, as the effect of gravity wants to extend the hip, which is opposite to the direction of movement of the hip flexors. Thus, the hip flexors are working against gravity to flex the hip. The third principle relates to range of motion. Strength testing via manual muscle testing requires range of motion data collection. The quantity of active range of motion of the movement must always be compared to the quantity of passive range of motion. In fact, their passive range of motion represents their full available range of motion. This patient has 50 degrees of active range of motion of the right shoulder flexion. Their full available range of motion of right shoulder flexion is 170 degrees, as is established by this passive range of motion measurement. The fourth principle relates to resistance. Resistance is applied only when the patient is strong enough. Often a strength grade can be assigned without applying any resistance at all. As will be explained further in the video, the patient can receive a strength grade for the shoulder flexors based on knowing that they can actively flex their shoulder against gravity, and that they cannot achieve their full available range of motion actively. That is, their passive range of motion is greater than their active range of motion. So in this case, a strength grade would be assigned without the application of resistance. Now that we've discussed the general principles behind manual muscle testing, it's time to apply these principles and discuss the procedure and grading system behind this strength technique or strength measurement technique. The first step in assigning a muscle grade is to determine whether or not the muscle or muscle group is strong enough to move the body segment against the resistance of gravity. Let's see if this patient's shoulder flexors are strong enough to flex the shoulder against gravity. In this case, the shoulder flexors are indeed strong enough to move the arm against the resistance of gravity. If the muscle or muscle group is strong enough to overcome the resistance of gravity, the next step is to determine if they are able to move the body segment through the full available range of motion. The full available range of motion, remember, is established by measuring passive range of motion. Therefore, the quantity of active range of motion in the against gravity position is compared to the passive range of motion for that same movement. Let's take a look at our patient's shoulder flexors once again. In this case, the shoulder flexors are not strong enough to flex the shoulder through the full available range of motion in the against gravity position. That is evidenced by the fact that there is less active range of motion than there is passive range of motion. If in the against gravity position, the active range of motion is less than half of the available range of motion, the test is complete and a grade of 2+ out of 5 is assigned. Let's have a look at our patient again. Here we see that the active range of motion is approximately 65 degrees in the against gravity position, whereas the passive range of motion, or full available range of motion, is approximately 175 degrees. The active range of motion is therefore less than half of the available range of motion in the against gravity position, and a grade of 2+ would be assigned to the shoulder flexors. If the patient's active range of motion in the against gravity position is greater than half, but less than their full available range of motion, a grade of 3- out of 5 is assigned and the test is complete. Here's an example of a patient whose right shoulder flexors score a 3- out of 5 on manual muscle testing. Here we see that the active range of motion is approximately 165 degrees in the against gravity position. The passive range of motion, or full available range of motion, is approximately 175 degrees. The active range of motion in the against gravity position is greater than half of the available range of motion, yet not full, so a grade of 3- would be assigned to the shoulder flexors in this case. If the active range of motion is equal to the passive range of motion in the against gravity position, a grade cannot be assigned before determining whether or not the muscle or muscle group is strong enough to withstand an externally applied resistance. In this case, the active range of motion in the against gravity position is equal to the full available range of motion for the right shoulder flexors. Thus, resistance must be applied before a grade can be assigned. After establishing that the patient can actively move through the full available range of motion against gravity, manual resistance is applied to the muscle group. If the patient cannot tolerate any resistance, a grade of 3 out of 5 is assigned and the test is complete. If the muscle can tolerate a minimal resistance, a grade of 3+ out of 5 is assigned and the test is complete. If the muscle can tolerate a moderate amount of resistance, a grade of 4 out of 5 is assigned and the test is then complete. Finally, if the muscle can tolerate a maximal resistance, a grade of 5 out of 5 is assigned and the test is complete. So grades 3 plus to 5 require resistance. Take a few moments to complete the table to define the missing strength grades. Pause the video and resume when you've completed the activity. Now that you've completed activity 1, take a few minutes to answer the following 2 questions. Once again, pause the video and resume play when you've completed the activity. The answer to this and all other activities in the video to follow, as well as the one prior to this one, activity 1, will be posted on the class Moodle page shortly. Here's another scenario of the same patient who had 170 degrees of passive range of motion of right shoulder flexion. Unlike the first scenario, the patient is not strong enough to flex his right shoulder against gravity. As a result, we cannot continue along the same protocol as we did when the previous scenario, we cannot continue along the same protocol as we did in the previous scenario, as nothing would happen. A strength grade still needs to be assigned, however. It must now be determined if this patient's right shoulder flexors are strong enough to flex when the effect of gravity is minimized. Without having to work against gravity, the muscle or muscle group is not required to work as hard as it did when it was in the against gravity position, and less strength is therefore required. Here's an example of a patient who cannot flex their shoulder in the gravity minimized position. Before assigning a grade, the muscle or muscle group is palpated to see if a muscle twitch is felt as the patient tries to flex their shoulder. If there is no palpable muscle twitch, a grade of 0 out of 5 is assigned. If, however, a muscle twitch is felt during the attempted flexion, despite there being no movement at all, a grade of 1 is assigned. Here's an example of a patient who can flex their shoulder in the gravity minimized plane. In order to assign a grade to a patient who can move in the gravity minimized plane, the active range of motion must be compared to the full available range of motion. This is exactly what was done in the against gravity plane. We're applying the same principle now in the gravity minimized plane. We're comparing the active range of motion to the passive range of motion in the gravity minimized plane. Let's take a look at this scenario in which the patient can flex their shoulder in the gravity minimized plane once again. When comparing the active range of motion to the full available range of motion, it's evident that this patient's active range of motion is less than half of their available range of motion. When the active range of motion in the gravity minimized plane is less than half the available range of motion, a grade of 1 plus is assigned. Here's a case when the patient's active range of motion is greater than half, but less than their full available range of motion in the gravity minimized plane. When the active range of motion is greater than half, but less than the full available range of motion in the gravity minimized plane, a grade of 2 minus is assigned. Here's another case when the patient's active range of motion is equal to their full available range of motion in the gravity minimized plane. When the active range of motion is equal to the full available range of motion in the gravity minimized plane, yet they are not strong enough to move in the against gravity plane, a grade of 2 is assigned. Once again, take a few minutes to complete the table to define the missing strength grades. Pause the video and resume when you've completed the activity. Now that you've completed activity 3, take a few moments to answer the following 2 questions in activity 4. Once again, pause the video and resume play when you've completed the activity. Watch the following video where 3 different scenarios are presented. Not all of the scenarios are correct. Can you determine which are correct and which are incorrect? Be sure to provide your justification and check the Moodle page by week's end to compare your answers.
Okay, so we're going to test your shoulder flexion strength. First, can you raise your arm above your head like that? Good. I want the patient to be sitting and with arms just relaxed at the side. Testing position is going to be with the hands pronated. I'm going to support the shoulder behind so I'm not limiting the shoulder movement here. I'm going to place her in mid-range, about shoulder height. All right, Laura Lynn, I'm going to push down, but don't let me push you all the way down, okay? Just hold your arm there. So hold. Hold, 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 hold. Good. That is a 5 holding against maximum resistance. So next, again, I'm going to put you in this testing position here. Don't let me push you down, okay? So I want you to hold, hold, hold. Okay, so that would be a 3. She broke under minimal resistance. And lastly, can you raise your arm again? Okay, so that would be a 2. Is just she can't get through the full range of motion, only partial range of motion.